Hi and welcome back to the Sword Studies series at the Academy of Historical Defence, and I'm Nick Thomas, and now we're going to be looking at a 1796 heavy cavalry trooper's sword that has had a few modifications. Now, I've got one of these of my own, and I will be showing that on the channel. I would have done it first actually, but as I've said previously, I have a friend's, some of a friend's collection with me right now, 10 swords or so, and I want to get them onto the Sword Studies series before I have to ship them on, and so I want to get through these swords and show you them before they vanish. So, the 1796 Heavy Cavalry Trooper's Sword is, of course, the sword famously used by Scots Grey at Waterloo, by Richard Sharp in the Bernard Cornwall films and books and films. And it is known today especially as a big, brutish, unwieldy, frankly rubbish sword is the way people tend to think of it. Now, I've now handled a lot, had a good swing of them. I've trained with training swords made to match them as well. And I can tell you that the reputation is not remotely fair. Now, there are limitations, but ultimately you will find complaints and limitations about every single sword. But personally, I find that the 1796 Heavy Cavalries, they can be really nice. They can be also very unwieldy. It depends how they were made, because there is plenty of variation. And this one I'm going to show you today is actually a bit shorter than normal and a bit lighter than normal, and with modifications. And all those things have made it actually quite a usable, manageable sword. So, in the Napoleonic period, you have, for the British, two kinds of cavalry. Now, in some armies, you also had a third kind of cavalry, which was basically your medium cavalry. But as far as Britain was concerned, there was just light cavalry and there was heavy cavalry. And just to confuse things, some European armies consider British heavy cavalry to only be medium, in large part because they didn't wear armour and things like that. But we won't worry about that too much for now. Light cavalry, they were used ideally more for scouting duties, harassing and things like that, and they would use, the stirrup-hilted light cavalry sabre. Incidentally, this one here, which is a lovely late Napoleonic pikeback with beak nose that I'll be showing soon, really nice sword. So they would have something that had great hacking power, not a lot of hand protection, and was well curved. But the heavy cavalry, they had this longer, straighter sword with more hand protection. Now, it was an near exact copy of an Austrian cavalry palash. The term palash I'll go into in another video, but ultimately this is a palash, okay? And it was a near direct copy of that old Austrian sword that had been in service for many decades by that point. And what it is as far as English would be concerned, it's a backsword. Now, the dragoon sword I showed in the last video, the kind of 1750s dragoon sword, how different is this to that one? The truth is not very, is that the hilt is simpler in construction. It's been made from this mostly single plate bent into place, as opposed to a more complex basket, but it still has a lot of hand protection. The blade is still very similar in characteristics. So stylistically, things had moved on, is that the hilt was simpler in construction and they'd gone to a back strap. But ultimately, how different is this to, say, the dragoon sword of the 1750s? Not that much, to be honest. It's mainly some stylistic changes that have been, copying more the kind of Austrian and continental styles of the time. So, we'd often call this a dish hilt for obvious reasons, for what it is. They are normally 35-inch blades by regulation, but many heavy cavalry swords were shortened. And in actual fact, the British heavy cavalry sword is probably the most modified sword of the Napoleonic period. They were shortened, they had tip modifications, they had guard modifications, they had langets removed, they had all kinds of things to make them better, either by soldiers in the field, because despite the fact they weren't supposed to modify their own equipment, we know it happened, it's actually documented, and sometimes by the orders of the colonel of the regiment, and even on a wider army-wide scale, which we know is also documented. So they were very heavily modified, and as a result, if you look at heavy cavalry swords surviving today, a huge amount of them have modifications. And unlike a lot of other antiques on the market, when you see antiques that have been shortened or modified in some way, it's so often been done way after their service period, and has been done by people to try and make broken antiques more valuable, by dealers to try and make their swords more valuable. But with the heavy cavalry swords, when you see them shortened and modified, it's usually legit period modifications done by the soldiers and by the regiment in that time period, which makes them quite interesting. Now, I said the regulation was a 35-inch blade. This one comes up at 33.5, which is just over 85 centimeters. So it's been shortened, but only a little bit. It means it's still longer than a light cavalry saber. It's still got good reach, and it's also had a reprofiled tip. So the original heavy cavalry swords had a very blunt, brutish hatchet tip, which is, you know, it's a good cut-in tip, but as far as thrust work goes, it was rubbish, and loads of them were modified. So this one has had a modified tip and been reduced during that change just a little bit. And there's a possibility that some British heavy cavalry swords were made in the roughly 33 to 33.5 inch range. Once the modifications were being done, it's possible they started making them that way from the factories. We're not entirely sure, but it's possible, particularly as how many seem to match very, very closely. So what else has this sword had done? Well, it's had the langets removed. So the langets normally protrude from these two holes here. They've gone. And it's had this guard, the back of the guard cut out here, which on my original, I've got this piece intact, whereas I've had the inner section cut out, which is more common. So I'll show that in another video. Whereas this is still a symmetrical hilt, but it's had the back cut out. Now, why would that be? My theory on this is it's all down to the methods that they were used for certain parries. So with the cavalry system, there is a parry called the arm protect, and it is like this. And the reason being is that when you're on horseback, you obviously have limited range of movement, and cuts tend to come in towards your basically sides and back that normally on foot you would easily be able to traverse and move your feet and things like that, as well as the fact that the swords tend to be a bit heavier and a bit more unwieldy than those used on foot. And so they have this arm protect, which is designed for when people attack your right side, and particularly when it comes round to this side here, so that we can protect all around our side here. Now, as you'll notice when I do the arm protect guard, this kind of cutout section sits really neatly on my wrist. And when I tested this with my my one that's got an intact back section where what you call the quillum would be, I found that it actually digs straight into the hand. So my feeling is this has been professionally done, and I don't think that's to do with anything post its service. I truly believe, looking at it and looking at the aging of it, that this is a period military modification that has been designed so that the arm protect guard works better and more comfortably. I think that's really curious. Now, I've not seen it on any others yet, so that's a curious one. If it genuinely is that useful, you'd expect to see it more, as well as the fact that this is a trooper's sword, and if it's a trooper's modification, you'd expect it to be seen more. Now, the only caveat I'll give to that is that we know that some cavalry officers did use troopers' swords. There are troopers' swords that have provenance to officers. There are troopers' swords that have blue and gilt blades, despite the fact they are a standard trooper's hilt and not an officer's example like this one here. And so I can't say for certain. That is my speculation, and I think it's pretty likely that's the reason for it. So let's look at some specification. So this heavy cavalry sword is 862 grams. Now that is light for its type. Most of these heavy cavalry troopers swords are around about 1 kilo, and they're usually between 1 and 1.1, depending on what modifications they've had. Sometimes with all the mods, they can come a little bit under 1 kilo. And okay, this has had some mods, but for it to go all the way down to 862, that is really unusual. So this is the lightest example I've ever seen of a trooper's sword. I've seen officers' examples this light, and actually a fraction lighter again. But the trooper's swords, this one is really, really light. Whereas you'll see that the Redl & Co. one that I personally own, I'll show in a future video, is more typical in weight. So this one is, yeah, it's unusually light. So I gave you the blade length. Let's now give the balance. Being heavy cavalry swords, we would expect them to balance far forward. This one's at 14 centimeters, which is fairly typical. Obviously, it's had a little bit of blade length reduced, so it probably would have been closer to 15 when it was at its original full length. Now, let's get into some measurements. So it's 8 millimeters thick, at the shoulder. Halfway down the blade, it's already dropped to 3.9. Roughly 10 centimeters from the tip, it's down to 2 millimeters. And in the actual tip, it is down to 1.1. So again, as is very, very typical, a lot of distal taper on these blades. And this is why the reproductions of these swords always handled so poorly, is that they don't get the distal taper, because as you can see, it doesn't have much profile taper, which is this width you're looking at. So that there is the distal taper, which it has a lot. But this profile taper, most British swords in this period have very little profile taper, sometimes even flare out in the opposite direction. So if we now look at that profile, it is 3.7 at the shoulder, down to 3.2 at the halfway point, and in the last 15 centimeters drops down to still 3.2. So yeah, it has realistically kind of nothing in terms of profile taper whatsoever, which makes it look like a very brutish sword, because it looks like a big iron bar. And yet, as you can tell from its weight and from its balance, it's not a big heavy sword at all. In fact, as much as it's a little bit, front heavy compared to some, say, infantry swords, it's similar to others. And I've got infantry sabers that have exactly this handling characteristic, despite the fact they're shorter. So yes, this is a lighter than normal example, but I will show a very typical weighted example in a future video. Aside from that, there's no maker's mark on this sword. Now, it's been in bad shape and it's been cleaned up, so it might have had a maker's mark originally, but we can't tell anymore. But the only modifications are langets removed, back of the guard cut away, and the tip remodeled. So that is an example of a modified and improved 1796 heavy cavalry trooper's sword that is remarkably nimble compared to what you might think. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already.